All right, good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce our Almond Conference sponsor, Beeflow. Beeflow is a biotech startup company that creates and manages pollination programs for farmers that increase crop yields by up to 60%, according to the company. Beeflow combines scientific knowledge of crop pollination, bee biology and behavior, and chemical ecology with proprietary technologies, including molecules that help train bees to pollinate specific crops like almonds, and a plant-based diet that enhances the bee's health and immune system. Beeflow's team includes experts that are biologists, ecologists, entomologists, agronomists, and entrepreneurs. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Angelita de la Luz, Global Director of Applied Science at Beeflow.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Great, so thank you, hello, and thank you for having me. My name's Angelita de la Luz. As she said, I am the Global Director of Applied Science at Beeflow. And so Beeflow is a company that provides professional pollination services to growers, with the goal of helping them increase their yields by paying particular attention to crop pollination management. Our company was founded in 2017, and we currently have operations in 4 countries, the US, Mexico, Peru, and Argentina. And we've been working in almonds here in the US since 2018, starting out with research and then moving on into field development. So a little bit about me before we get started. I earned my PhD from UC Santa Cruz, where I studied plant-pollinator interactions in the form of networks in nature, and was really focused on how those networks were rearranging themselves over the past few decades. And so now I'm taking what I learned and applying it to the agriculture system with the goal of building a food system in harmony with nature. And so I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about pollination and to work in this field because pollination is really important. And this is a stat that you've probably heard before, but 70% of crops depend on pollination. That means that 3 out of every 4 bites of food that you eat every single day is the result of pollination. And that scales up to $577 billion in annual food production, or if we think about it another way, about 1 billion jobs globally. And that's not even counting agriculture adjacent jobs like commercial trucking, restaurants and grocery stores, and even cosmetics companies. So for most farming operations, getting pollination right is critical to crop production. And that's because pollination isn't just an event that happens during the year, it's part of the crop management cycle. So before the bloom, crop management practices like pruning set up the bud count on the crop, and that ensures an attractive bloom for pollinators. But it's actually the number of successfully pollinated flowers that sets the yield potential for the grower, and that's because beyond this point, there's no more flowers being produced on the crop. So you've got to get it right in that moment. And then after that, it goes back to crop management to make sure that you're holding on to all of those developing fruits all the way through to harvest. So I want to take a step back. And talk about what is pollination. Pollination is a biological process between plants and bees, and it represents one of the most impactful mutualistic ecosystem services on the planet. So not only do we depend on pollination for our survival through the food system, but ecosystems around the world would not persist without pollination to sustain them. Now, in the most simple terms, pollination is the movement of pollen between flowers, but it's actually incredibly complex. It's a form of cross-species communication between plants and bees that helps them in their reproduction. And plants, which are fixed in space and can't move to get together, they need bees to move the pollen around, and they attract them using signals like flower shape, color, the odor from the flower, among other things. Now, bees have to be able to receive and interpret those signals in order to make the best choices for themselves in terms of where they spend their time and energy. And that's measured in pollen and nectar, the rewards that the flowers give back to those bees. So in order for this to work well, it actually requires information from a lot of different scientific disciplines, everything from ecology and agronomy, visual processing, animal communication, physiology, coevolution, atmospheric science, all of that. And what Beeflow is doing is working to understand all of this complexity, break it down, and then apply it to crop pollination so that growers can get the most out of the interaction and produce more on the same amount of land. That's the goal. Now, despite its importance, pollination has received relatively little attention compared to other inputs like fertilizers, crop protection, irrigation, and genetics, all of which are represented by a lot of companies that you're probably familiar with, right? But when it comes to pollination, Beeflow is the only company that is focusing on enhancing this interaction by turning our attention to where pollination happens, on the flower, in the crop, and therefore driving positive impacts for growers. So over time, we've identified a few key drivers that help to optimize pollination. And for starters, we can talk about plant physiology. So having a healthy plant to start with is how you're going to ensure that that plant is producing good quality and quantity of resources to attract bees. So if a plant can't attract pollinators or pollinators can't otherwise do their work well, then we see fewer fruits produced, we see higher rates of malformation. Basically, we see fewer fruits that can be sold. On the other side of this interaction, we have a deep understanding of how bees process, remember, and communicate information about what plants exist in the landscape and where to find them. But it's really not enough to just know about this. And so we use this information to optimize pollination by tapping into the system, for example, with one of our technologies that helps to train the bees or bias them to visit a specific crop. And so the way that this technology works is classical conditioning, commonly known as Pavlov's dogs, where you ring the bell, you give the dog a treat, you ring the bell, you give the dog a treat, and when you ring the bell, and this time you don't give the dog a treat, but the dog salivates anyway because it's learned to expect the reward. Now it turns out that you can do the exact same thing with bees, but instead of the bell, we use the smell of the crop. Every flower has a distinct aroma, and that aroma is made up of specific molecules called volatiles. And that mix of volatiles is what makes the crop flowers smell the way they do. It's what gives the almond flower that distinctive marzipan aroma. And so we have synthesized this in the lab, and we give it back to the bees together with a high-value treat or reward in the colony. We don't apply anything to the crop. All of this training is done at the colony level. And then when those bees leave the colony and they're out in nature looking for food, they encounter the crop and they remember, hey, that smell means something really good. And so they're more likely to spend more of their time visiting those flowers in search of that high-value reward. Now, this training lasts about 2 weeks, about the length of the almond bloom. In crops that have a longer bloom, then we train them multiple times to keep that colony's memory in line with the crop. So we have this technology for several crops. We have it for almonds, for blueberries, sunflower, onion seed, and we have several more in development right now. And then the final key driver I want to talk about is bee health, which we all know is extremely important to successful pollination. But it's no secret that farms are a harsh environment for pollinators, right? They're exposed to a lot of pesticides. Often there's not enough clean water for them, which they really need. And there's poor resource availability in the form of alternative plants that make up a complete diet for these bees. And so we've recognized a need to help support these pollinators while they're doing the work of pollination for us. And so we've developed a nutritional supplement that replaces some key amino acids in the bees' diet that they would otherwise find in a diverse floral environment. And we find that bees fed with this technology are not only healthier and less resistant to stress, but they also forage at cooler temperatures. And so this is really important in crops like almonds that bloom in early spring when the temperatures at the beginning of bloom can be quite low. And so being able to capture that pollination window is really important. So as I said, we have been doing a lot of learning in almonds over the past few years. Our most recent published research came out last year in apidology. And for this work, we spent time in orchards following bees around, trying to understand where they're visiting, what resources they're collecting, and when. And we did this study because we wanted to understand how one of our technologies, the one around cold weather foraging, interacts with what's going on in the crop physiologically. And our results show that bees forage differently depending on the time of day and by variety. So in this figure, what I'm showing on the y-axis is the percent of foraging bees on either pollen, which is shown in the gray color, or nectar, which is shown in white. And then in the morning, if we were on the x-axis, in the morning and afternoon for two varieties that were grown together in the same orchard. And so what we found was that more bees were spending more time collecting pollen in the mornings, and then they shifted to nectar in the afternoon. So what this means is that there's a higher concentration of pollen moving around the orchard in the mornings when it's cooler. And so this is really the time that you want to have the most bees working in the field as possible to maximize your pollination. And it aligns really well with the use of one of our nutritional supplement. Now, in another study, we were really curious at the time to understand if bees helped to increase yields in the Independence variety. Now, we all know Independence is a self-fertile variety and is often understood as not needing bees, and that was certainly the understanding at the time that we did this study. And so to test this, we built what are called exclosures, and you can see them in the photo there. They're giant cages that covered the entire tree, so those trees didn't receive any bee visits. And we compared the whole tree yield from those trees to nearby trees that were uncaged, were fully accessible to pollinators, and were completely unmanipulated. In addition to this, just to be sure, we added a control, which is the same wooden structure that you see in the cage, but only had the mesh on top. And this creates the same shade, but allows pollinators access to the tree. And in this way, we can separate the effect of the cage itself from pollination. And so here are the results. So after the bloom, we allowed the crop developed normally. We went back and we looked at fruit set, which is the number of flowers that successfully turn into a harvestable kernel in this case, and also whole tree yields. So on the x-axis, we have the treatment, which is the cage or isolation treatment, the completely open treatment, and then the control, which just had the shade but still had access to pollinators. And on that figure there, on the far side, we have the proportion of flowers turned into fruit or fruit set initially and then after the June drop. So that's in gray and white respectively. And so these results showed that we had twice as many initial fruits, 2 times higher fruit set initially, and then that dropped off to 60% higher fruit set during after the drop. And then when we harvested all of those kernels and we weighed them all together for the whole tree yields, then we also saw a 20% increase in kernel yields between the treatments. And so based on these results, we really do recommend the use of bees in these self-fertile varieties. However, we're still conducting research to understand what the stocking density is, and we've done that research over the past couple of years, ranging from 0 to 2 hives per acre, which is industry standard for non-self-fertile varieties. And so we're trying to tease that apart so that growers know sort of what's the best value in terms of the number of hives to put on these farms to maximize their yields. So just like pest pressure, soil moisture, and chill hours are important to monitor, we believe that by measuring pollination, growers can be armed with important insights about a critical moment in the crop cycle. At Beeflow, we're the experts on crop pollination, managing one of the most important drivers of yield potential. And through our research, we're finding that there's really a narrow window of opportunity to maximize those yields. That's early in the morning when we know that low temperatures can slow bees down. With our management, we've seen an average of 32% more visits to almond flowers, and this has real implications for yields. For example, we've seen fewer aborted fruits on the trees that we pollinate and larger fruits even when those trees are producing the same number of kernels. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining me and for your time. I am really humbled to be up on this stage with all the other folks who will be speaking, and I want to share with you all, and I know you've all received some flyers, but we'll be hosting a happy hour just outside of the convention center today at SMICS at 5:30, and we'd love it if you could join us. We'd love to talk about pollination with you, and I'll be there as well as some of my colleagues, and we'd love to talk about how we can work together to help you maximize your yield potential. So thank you for that, and we look forward to visiting with you. And we have some time for questions, so happy to answer any questions. For the Independence variety? Yeah, so we're still doing that research. We're still trying to understand that. We're also looking for grower partners to help us answer that question. So we'd love to talk to you if that's something you'd be interested in. Yeah, sure. Great. Any other questions?
I had a quick question about if a grower was interested in what they're hearing about the amazing results that you have seen in the field, how do they work with an existing apiary to use some of these technologies?
That's a really good question. So there's a couple of options. We are building a network of third-party beekeepers, basically a network of pollinators that we can work together so that we can teach you how to apply the technologies. And you can work with the beekeeper you've always worked with as long as they're open to learning these new techniques and methodologies that we've been testing in the field. Great, thank you. And any other questions? All right, well, I really hope to see you at the happy hour and would love to talk to you more about this topic. Thank you all so much.